Hey, this is Elijah with the Oxygen team, and in this video, we're going to take a closer look at utility classes in Oxygen. A utility class is a CSS class that performs usually a singular function. We've talked a little bit about this concept in a previous video on layered classes, where we showed how to apply layered classes to create buttons. But in this video, we're going to be walking through several other utility classes that you can set up on your Oxygen site, and then I'll show you how to reuse your utility class system on other sites using the Oxygen User Design Library feature. So let's jump back to the WordPress admin panel, and I've already got Oxygen installed, and this is a fresh instance, so we're just going to go to Pages and Sample Page and edit that in Oxygen. All right, now we're in the builder. Let's just set up a few elements to start adding these utility classes. So I'll just add a section, and then I'll add a link wrapper and just add some text in that link wrapper. Now let's start with the section, because we can create most of the classes we need and see how they impact the element with a section. One of the most common utility classes that I personally use is a box shadow class. That's because I like for all of my box shadows across all of my elements to be very consistent on a site that I'm building. And I like to use custom box shadows from a box shadow generator. So let's jump over here. I've already got it open. It's at brumm.af/shadows. This is a really nice natural looking box shadow generator that gives you the CSS code here based on the parameters that you've set on the right hand side. I've already made a few adjustments here, so I'm just going to copy this box shadow code, and then we're going to jump over to Oxygen and let's make our first utility class. So to add a class, we're going to go over to the properties pane with an element selected, and we're going to click this drop down here. It may say choose selector to edit, or it may show the element's ID like that. Either way, we need to click it, and then we have a field where we can type a class name. So we're going to type box-shadow. And then click Add Class. So this class is a utility class, and its singular purpose is to add a box shadow to an element. So let's go to Advanced Custom CSS, since we're using our custom box shadow, and we'll paste that code in. And you can see it's now applied in the builder to the section. Perfect. So we have our first utility class. And just to illustrate how you might use this, we could select, say, this link wrapper and decide we want a box shadow on it. And we just open up our selector dropdown in the properties pane and type box or shadow, and it's going to show us that box shadow exists. And we drop that in, and it applies the box shadow to that element. So as easy as that, we've created a really useful utility class that will help us to keep our design much more consistent. And there, of course, are a few others that I like to use. So one would be rounded corners for rounded border radius values. So we're going to do rounded dash corners, and we're going to add that class. Then we go to advanced borders and change the border radius to whatever we like. I usually go with 8 or 12 pixels. 8 tends to be a little bit more subtle. And now we've applied that to our section. And again, we're just applying these to the section just to add them into Oxygen. This is really more of a setup step. Later, you would use these on actual elements, and we'll go over that as well. So we've got rounded corners. Another thing that you often want to set very consistently is transition for elements when changes are happening, whether they're hovered or entering some other state. You want the transition, duration, and easing to be the same on all elements to maintain consistency. So let's just add a transition class here. And this class will go to Advanced Effects, Transition, and then we'll just set the transition duration to whatever we want that to be for all the elements. And then ease dash in dash out. There are other timing functions, but this is the one I typically choose. So now we have these three utility classes: box shadow, rounded corners, and transition. There's another slightly more specialized class that we can set up, which requires that it's applied to a specific type of element, like a div, but this is a horizontal divider. So let's add a div This is something that folks often wonder how to do in Oxygen, so it's nice to set up a class for this. So basically, we're going to add a horizontal divider class to this div. And then because Oxygen forces divs to be at least 80 pixels high and wide in the builder so that you can still drag elements into them, we need to override that with some custom CSS. So we'll go to Advanced, Custom CSS, and we're going to set the min height to 0 pixels, and we have to add an important tag here so that it overrides the Oxygen builder styles. And then we can go into size and spacing and set the height to say 1 pixel, width to 100%, and then the background color to whatever color we'd like. We'll go with something dark here, and I'm just going to save that color for use later. So now we have a nice horizontal divider there that we can reuse later just by adding a div and dropping the horizontal divider class on the div. Another really handy way to use utility classes is for margins and padding. So let's set up a couple of classes for margins. So we're going to do margin-bottom because this is typically the one you're setting to control spacing between elements in a vertical layout. So we're going to do margin bottom-small. And actually, because we can't set margins on sections, we're going to have to do this on one of our other elements. So we'll just select our horizontal divider here. And that class has already been added, so we can just type margin, and margin bottom small is going to show up. Then we can go to Advanced, Size and Spacing, and set it to whatever we want our small margin bottom increment to be. In this case, I like to use 8 pixel increments, so I'm going to go 16 on that. Then we're going to add margin bottom medium, and this is going to be 32 pixels, and then margin bottom large, and this is going to be 64 pixels. So while these are utility classes, we're almost setting up kind of a mini CSS framework here. And the beauty is you really should only have to do this once if you design fairly consistently, though sometimes your bespoke designs are going to have different spacings and things like that. Obviously, you could use these classes and then adjust the values depending on the site you're working on. So now we have our margins. Let's go ahead and add some padding classes. So I'm going to go in here and just add a div. And again, none of these elements really matter. I'm just using them to set up the classes for later use. So I'm going to drop in just a heading or something there so that we can see the padding values that are being used. And we'll select the div and we'll start adding our classes to it. So we're going to create a utility class that adds padding all the way around of some value. So we'll do padding small. And we'll go to Advanced Size and Spacing and do that as, say, 16 pixels. We use probably the same increments we used on our margin bottom. Now we'll do padding medium. And we'll do 32 pixels. And we'll do padding large. And we'll do 64 pixels here. These are just kind of the values that end up being the most useful to me during the design process in Oxygen. So it makes sense to set up your margin bottoms and your paddings and things like that so that they're really easy to apply. Another thing we might want to do is have a couple of classes for background colors. So let's select our section again, and we're just going to add a class called bg-color-light. And on this, we'll set a fairly light but not quite white background color. Then let's make a dark version of this. We'll go bg-color-dark, and we're going to choose that same dark color that we used previously, which is still on my clipboard. Perfect. And then we're going to set up one more I like to use occasionally, which would be a gradient background. So bg-color, we'll do gradient first. And let's jump over here to uigradients.com. I already have one I really like, so I'm just going to copy these hex values off, and with the bg-color-gradient class selected, I'm going to go to Advanced, Background, Gradient, and add those colors. So there's the first color, and here comes the second color. Perfect. And I usually like to change the angle on these, do like 120 degrees. You can adjust it to whatever you need, of course. Now, before we move on to styling elements within this section, I'm going to go ahead and get rid of this gradient background, which we will use later, but we don't need on this section. And we're going to get rid of the dark background, and that brings us back to the light colored background for this section, which will make it easier to see what we're doing on subsequent elements. So that's the bulk of our utility classes, at least the ones that I normally use. The final couple of ones we want to set up would be buttons, right? So that's why we have this text link or this link wrapper up here ready to go. So we're going to select the link wrapper, and we're going to add a button-dark class to this. I like to have usually two variations of a button, one that's dark with a filled-in background, and one that has a lighter or transparent background with an outline. So we'll start with the dark one. We're going to set the background color to our dark gray that we used previously. Let's jump up here and grab that. And then because we know this button is always going to be dark, we want to make sure that the typography is controlled by the button and not the text that's within the link wrapper. So we'll go to Advanced Typography, and we'll just set our text color to white, and we'll set our font weight to something like 600. And then we need to adjust the size and spacing on this. You could use your utility classes, but buttons typically have a smaller padding on the top and bottom than they do on the left and right. So in this case, we're going to do 8 pixels on the top, 8 pixels on the bottom, and 32 left and right. And then buttons, of course, typically have a hover state. So let's go to the state dropdown and select hover, and we'll go to Advanced Background. And we'll just adjust this background color a bit, maybe make it slightly transparent on hover. And go back here to original. And now when that's hovered, it's going to change to a slightly transparent background color. Now we have some decisions to make here. We could make that button-dark class carry all of the attributes of the button, like the rounded corners, the box shadow, and the transition. But since we have the utility classes for those things, and since we may later want to change some of those things, we want it to be consistent across our entire site, we're just going to use those utility classes. So we know this button, we want it to have rounded corners, so we just type round and it's going to show rounded corners. Perfect. And then we know we want it to transition slowly when it's hovered between that dark background color and a slightly transparent version of that background color. So we're going to add our transition class. So now we have a button that has rounded corners and a nice slow transition. In this case, for this particular demonstration, we're also going to add some margin to the bottom of this. So let's just add medium so we get that horizontal divider away, and we can see we have a nice subtle box shadow. I believe we added that. Yes, we have our box shadow there. We have our rounded corners, and we have our hover transition. So this is going to be button dark. Now we're just going to duplicate this, and we're going to change the text on this to say button light, and then we're going to make some styling adjustments here. Now it's important to pay attention to which class you have selected before you start making edits. In this case, we don't want to edit our margin bottom, transition, rounded corners, or box shadow classes, because that'll change things on every element that uses those classes. Instead, we actually want to make essentially a copy of button-dark and then make some adjustments to that copy. So we're going to add a new class called button-outline. And once that's added, we can go in and find button dark, and we're going to click this copy icon, and then we're going to go down and click button outline, and that's going to copy all the styles from button dark to button outline. Now we can remove button dark from this particular instance. The class still exists and can still be used, but we don't want it on this button. So now we have button outline selected. We're going to go ahead and change the background color to transparent, and then we're going to go to Advanced Typography, and we're going to change the font color to our dark color we have up here. And then we're going to go to Advanced Borders. Then we're going to set our border color to that same dark color we have, solid, 1 pixel width. So now we have 2 button styles, and of course we need a different hover effect on this particular button. So we'll go to State Hover, and we'll go to Advanced Background, and we're just going to change that background color to a very, very light off-white. So now you'll see we have a nice subtle hover effect there on both buttons. So now if we want to just take a look at all the classes we've set up, we can go to Manage, Selectors, and they're going to show up in this uncategorized list. And you can see here we have a pretty decent start to a utility class system that will let us really quickly style elements. So just to demonstrate it, we're going to go build something out. So let's jump back to WordPress admin. And back here, we're going to add a new page, and we're just going to call this utility test. And let's publish that. And we'll edit it with Oxygen. Great, so now we're on a completely blank page. Let's just build something out using the utility classes that we created. So we're going to add a section. And one thing I do want to note is that on top of these utility classes, when you're first starting out with a design, you'll also want to go to Manage, Settings, Global Styles, and make sure you set up your global colors, fonts, headings, body text, the section padding is an important one, just so that you have those nice consistent styles set where they can be set in Oxygen's global styles. Then the utility classes will do the rest. So let's add some columns here. And we'll do a 60-40. And I'm just going to add a heading and then some text and then a link wrapper. And then some more text in that link wrapper. And then over here, we're going to add an image. This is going to be kind of a little hero / call to action section. And we'll browse. I've got a couple images up here I'm just going to drop in for use. We may not use all of them, but I wanted them available. There we go. Now let's just change this. My utility classes rock. And then this is some subtext talking about how awesome these classes are. And then this is do this thing because it's a call to action. Okay, so now we have our basic elements set up. Let's use our utility classes to style them. So the first thing we have is we probably want some margin below this heading. So let's go ahead and add a small bottom margin. Then let's add medium bottom margin to this one. Perfect. Now let's style our button up. This one is going to be a gradient button, which is going to be a combination of our button styles and the gradient background class that we set up. So we know we want it to be a button. So let's just start with button dark. Then let's add gradient background color. Then we know we want it to have rounded corners and probably a box shadow. So we'll do rounded and then box shadow. So there we have a really stylish button set up pretty quickly. And our spacing is nice and consistent. And again, our heading styles would need to be set up in the global style. So let's go to Manage Settings, Headings. And the one thing I really just want to adjust is line height, because having larger line height kind of bothers me. So now we have those styles set up, and we want to apply some styles to the image. I want rounded corners, and I want a box shadow on that as well. All right, that's perfect. So now we have a really quickly set up section here that's kind of a call to action situation. Let's just center this like that. And now let's add another section and see what else we can do with these utility classes. So let's add a section here. And let's set this one to a dark background. So we're going to use the bg-color-dark class that we set up. And then let's add some cards here. So let's add a column section. And we'll just do 3 columns for now. And then let's select this leftmost div here, and we'll add a div into that. And so we're not going to have all the styles we need in our utility classes for a card, because a card really isn't a utility class. It's more specialized. So we're just going to set up a class here called card. And this is going to hold those extra styles that we need. And mostly we just needed to have the width of 100%. The rest of it we can actually do with our utility classes. So we want a light background. We want medium padding. And we want rounded corners. I mean, that's pretty much sets up a card for us. Now we can add something like an icon. Let's set that to solid and add the box shadow class to that. Just going to give us a nice subtle box shadow effect. Then let's add a heading, set it to H2. And again, we haven't really styled our headings, but this is something you can do in the Oxygen Global styles. So we're going to call this card 1. And then let's just add some text here. And this will have some text that is important for the card so that you can read it. Perfect. So now we can use our utility classes to add some bottom margin and space these things out. So we're going to do small between the icon and the heading. And then let's try medium between the heading and the text. Perfect. And now we can center everything here. And again, make sure you don't change anything on your utility classes except for the things that class is responsible for. So you wouldn't want to have the rounded corners class selected and change your layout. You would actually want to make sure that you have your card class selected if you're using a card class, and then you can adjust your layout. All right, so let's duplicate this card a couple of times, and let's just drop them over into these other divs. Then let's just do one more thing here, and let's add the gradient background to this middle card. And then we'll just change these font colors. And again, we're going up here and making sure we're not changing styles on a class that class isn't responsible for. So in this case, we're using the ID of the element, and we're going to change the text color to white. And on this text element, we're going to change the text color to white. So now we have a nice card-based layout here, and just for fun, let's add another button below this. So let's add a link wrapper and add some text, and just call this buy now or something like that. And then we'll want to select the link wrapper here and add our styles to it. So we're doing another gradient button. So we'll do button dark, and then we'll do rounded corners. We don't need a box shadow because we're on a dark background and you obviously won't see it. So we'll add the gradient background there. And then we're going to select this section and go up and make sure we have the ID selected, and we're going to center everything. Now let's add some margin to the bottom of these columns, and I don't have to guess what number to use. Obviously, I've got my utility classes, so I'm going to add margin medium maybe. Perfect. So now let's take a look on the front end. And this is a really nicely laid out, consistent design, and I'm not a designer. So the key to designing things that look pretty good as someone that's not a designer is to establish rules you can follow. And that's what these utility classes help you do, in combination with things like design systems, which we've talked about in previous videos. And we're also applying the concept of layered classes here. Now, say you're building a lot of websites and you have a set of utility classes that you like to use. We can actually import those using Oxygen's user design library feature. So what you would do is you would create a site like this where you have one page where all of your classes are in use. And we've already got that set up here, so I'll just show you what it takes to convert this to a design set that can be imported. So we'll go back here, make sure this is saved, and then we'll go to admin. And we're going to need to go to Oxygen settings, library, and then we're going to want to make this WordPress install a design set. Now you'll have a key here. That's how you're going to import the design set onto your other sites, but we don't have to worry about that just yet. We need to go back to our pages, back to our page where we set up all of our utility classes, and we're going to scroll down to the Oxygen meta box, and you'll see some design set options here. So I would usually probably check include this entire page in the library, and then you want to categorize it as whatever will be convenient, because this is going to be the only page in this design set. Now, I'll show you what it looks like to import this. So I'm actually going to fire up a brand new blank Oxygen install on our sandbox server here. And for this, I'm just going to choose blank install. And then let's say this is a fresh site I'm getting ready to start building and I want my utility classes. We would go to Oxygen settings, library, and then we want to make sure we check enable third-party design sets and update, and then add design set. And then that's where that key is going to come in, which I have a key right here to import all of our utility classes. We're going to paste that in, click Add Source Site. Now, if we go to Pages and Sample Page, we'll just edit that with Oxygen. Now, to get all these classes into your new install, you're going to have to import that page that contains all the classes at least once. So let's add Library, Design Sets, and then find the design set we just added, find the page, and just add that in. Now you'll see everything's been imported. All of our classes should be there. We need to save once, and then we can delete all this and start working. And you'll see if we go to Manage Selectors, you'll now have all of those utility classes that were set up previously. So in this way, you can build a utility class system that's not only useful for one site, but for every site that you build with Oxygen. And trust me, this will save you tons of time, especially if you are wearing both the hats of designer and developer, and if you're designing on page instead of mocking up in something like Figma or Sketch. This will let you really quickly get a nice looking, consistent design on the page for your client to approve, and then it makes it really, really easy to build out the remainder of the site once they've approved the look and feel. So again, this is Elijah with the Oxygen team, and that's how to use utility classes in Oxygen to make building sites super easy and efficient. Thank you for watching.